Hey, this is Jared, and I'm going to be doing a Final Fantasy rank list. Final Fantasy is my all-time favorite game series, and I have been playing the games for over 25 years now. And over that time, I have played every mainline game and several of the spin-offs. I will not be including any spin-offs or sequels in this list, but may talk about them in a later video. This list is just going to cover the mainline series from Final Fantasy 1 to Final Fantasy 16. This is all my personal opinion, and I tried to be fair not only in regards to the development of each title, but my personal feelings in the matter, and nostalgia. As we all know, nostalgia can be a very powerful drug, and that is why I love seeing different Final Fantasy tier lists, because they are all unique and different. Anyways, time to start at the bottom of the list. And here, I'm afraid I have to put Final Fantasy XI. This is nothing against the game really, it's just that I don't have as much experience with it like all of the others. Final Fantasy XI was released in 2002 for the PC as an MMORPG, the first in the series. I have a funny memory with this game, as I bought the Xbox 360 version of the game in 2005 or 2006 and attempted to play through it. But Play Online, the launcher that was required to play the game, refused to work on my Xbox 360 console. I kept getting error codes and launch failures, resulting in me basically spending $60 for a GameBox paperweight. I tried contacting Square and Microsoft multiple times, but neither could seem to help or solve the issues I was having, so I never actually got a chance to play the game back then. I did finally play the game for the first time in late 2023, and it's about what I expected. I have to give props though to the development team, who still update the game and adds new events to this day 22 years later. They put a lot of love into the game. It's got that archaic MMO design, which didn't really bother me because I played Ultima Online in the early 2000s and would go on to play World of Warcraft when it launched. But you can tell that it is definitely a pre-World of Warcraft MMO. And it may not be for everyone, especially if you've never played games like this back in the late 90s or early 2000s, before World of Warcraft basically became the template for every MMO that came out after 2004. I spent a good 2 months in the game, leveling a character up to the 60s, and completed the base game story. I haven't began any of the expansions yet, but I plan to. But still, this game had to be at the bottom of my list at number 16. Next, I have to go with Final Fantasy II. This game came out in 1988, and while there's really nothing wrong with this game, it's just very simplistic and basic in its design and doesn't hold up as well as the others. It had a rather unique way you level up your characters, in that their stats increase based on what you do with them in battle. If you want a character to increase their strength or weapon skill, make them a melee fighter and attack. If you want a character to increase their magic, cast spells. If you want a character's defense or HP to increase, have them get hit in battle. You can even attack your own characters yourself, and this will count towards increasing their defense and HP at the end of the encounter. The story was very simple. You play as a group of orphans whose parents were killed and village attacked by an invading empire. You then spend the game joining a resistance and taking the fight back to the empire. It was more story heavy compared to the initial entry in the series, but I still find it the weakest of the original Nintendo titles, and so it has to be number 15 on my list. Next, at number 14, it's the beginning of the franchise, Final Fantasy I. Released in 1987, it has become a video game urban legend today that it was called Final Fantasy because it was to be Square's final game developed after a recent string of failed releases. And that if the game didn't sell well, Square would have possibly folded and the developers would have moved on to other work. Thankfully, the game sold tremendously well, and who knew at the time that it would be the start of a franchise that would still be going strong 37 years later. The urban legend about the name Final Fantasy is also kind of incorrect. The original name was going to be called Fighting Fantasy, but as there was already an American board game and novel that went by this title, to avoid any legal or copyright issues, Square then settled on the name Final Fantasy. Not as cool of a story, but oh well. In the game, you play as 4 Warriors of Light, who go around the world to restore the 4 crystals to their former glory. You choose classes for your 4 characters at the start of the game, and these included what would become Final Fantasy staples in the future: Fighter, Black Mage, White Mage, Monk, Thief, and Red Mage. There wasn't much story in this initial title. Objectives basically wound down to go to this town or dungeon, defeat a boss, get a key item that now unlocks a new town or dungeon, rinse and repeat. Very simplistic, and because of that, even though it is the initial title, it is low on the list simply because the other games are better. But there's no denying that it set the groundwork for all of the masterpiece titles to come. Which brings me to number 13 on my list, and I have to go with, fittingly, Final Fantasy XIII. The game was released in 2009, and I personally just wasn't a big fan of this title. You play as a group of characters who have been branded as outlaws by the world's government known as Sanctum. You rally against the Sanctum while trying to discover the secrets and tasks that have been set against you. This entry also saw the introduction of what was known as the Paradigm Battle System. You could set paradigms to your party members, giving them a specific role in combat, roughly akin to the job system from previous games. Overall, I wasn't a big fan of the characters or the story, and the game spawned 2 further sequels that just added to my overall discontent with the title. I will admit, I have never played Final Fantasy XIII-2 or XIII-3, but that's simply because I was not a fan of 13 itself. The game's visuals and presentation were amazing, but the battle system, characters, and story fell flat for me, and that is why it gets this low rank on my list. Next, at number 12, I have to go with Final Fantasy XV. Now hear me out. I was a huge fan of the original, traditional Final Fantasy games. I have nothing against the series evolving and changing from the famous turn-based battle system to more open, hack-and-slash, real-time gameplay. The battle system is not the reason I have an issue with Final Fantasy XV. I personally enjoyed Final Fantasy XII, but it released to very mixed reviews due to the initial transition from active turn-based combat to real-time action. Final Fantasy XIII didn't really help this. As I stated already, I didn't enjoy the title. So there was this huge lull of great Final Fantasy titles ever since the release of Final Fantasy X way back in 2001. And then comes Final Fantasy XV in 2016, a game that spent over a decade in development and changing producers and direction multiple times in that decade. I had high hopes for this game and bought it day one for $60, and what I got was an incomplete story. Main character Noctis and his brothers-in-arms are the beating heart of the game, but the low-effort, incomplete story, boring open world, and bland side quests left a sour taste in my mouth. This was most of the criticism at launch too, which is why Square developed and released multiple paid DLC to the game to further expand upon the story and make it feel more complete, which made me feel betrayed as a die-hard fan, who had already paid their $60 on day one to get an incomplete experience. I refused to spend another $40 to $50 to pay for more story content that really should have been there in the beginning. And to this day, I still have not replayed Final Fantasy XV since the original launch, or pay for and experience the paid DLC add-ons. Which is such a shame, because one of the few things Final Fantasy XV did right was introduce a compelling and terrifying villain in Ardyn Izunia. But a few areas of praise could not make up for the mediocrity the remainder of the game was, and that is why it is amongst my lowest ranked Final Fantasy games. Next, at number 11, is Final Fantasy III. Released in 1990, Final Fantasy III is the best of those original first 3 titles. It took everything that was great about Final Fantasy 1 and 2 and just mashed them together. It also introduced us to the iconic job system, where you could change your 4 party members into any specific job to do battle with. This turned certain encounters and boss fights into puzzles, as you sometimes had to use certain jobs to counter certain mechanics. These jobs were greatly expanded upon from the initial title, and it would introduce what would become later series staples. You have the classic Fighter, Black Mage, Red Mage, Monk, and Thief from Final Fantasy I, but also added were Knight, and Scholar, and Geomancer, and Dragoon, and Dark Knight, and Summoner, and Sage. The combat and job system is the highlight of the game, but the story is also compelling, if not just an improvement on what had already come before. You play as 4 orphaned youths who are drawn to the Crystals of Light. The crystal grants them power in the form of the various jobs you unlock throughout the game, and as 4 youths, you go forth and restore balance to the world. If I was ever given the choice of replaying one of the original 3 Nintendo titles, I would always choose Final Fantasy III over 1 and 2, and that's why it's higher than those on my list, but just still not as good as what's to come. And with that, we are in the top 10. All of these upcoming games are great in their own way, and the listing may even be swayed back and forth depending on the time of year or what's going on my mind at the time. But I tried to be fair and put this down definitively, so here we go. Number 10 is Final Fantasy XII. Released in 2006, this title marked the first in a departure of the turn-based active time bar system that had been in every Final Fantasy going back to Final Fantasy IV. It introduced instead the beginning of a more action-style battle system. You could control your character for the first time in a real-time battle and move around the battlefield, with input still being selected by a command window. A new feature is the Gambit system, where you could program each AI character you're not controlling to auto-perform certain actions in combat. It was fun to play around with, a lot better than the paradigm system that would occur in Final Fantasy XIII years later. The story is another Resistance versus Empire trope, with the kingdom of Dalmasca being caught between 2 other warring nations. When Dalmasca is annexed by the kingdom of Arcadia, its Princess Ashe creates a resistant movement. During the struggle, she meets Vaan, a young adventurer who dreams of becoming a sky pirate in command of his own airship. They are quickly joined by a band of allies, and together they rally against the tyranny of the Arcadian Empire. The game is fine and fun, but one of my biggest complaints is that Vaan and Penelo are considered the 2 main characters of the game, when the supporting cast have much more interesting story bits and are even responsible for driving the plot along. Vaan and Penelo just kind of tag along with these other characters, like Princess Ashe, Balthier, Bosch, and Fran, who actually drive the story and have great character development throughout. Vaan is just kind of along for the ride, which really bugged me that he gets the spotlight most of the time. Another complaint is the back and forth traveling around, which just makes certain sections of the game tedious. Other than that, the game is praised for its graphics, scenario, game system, and the freshness it brought to the Final Fantasy series, and enough so that it deserves the number 10 spot on my list. Next up at number 9 is Final Fantasy V. Released in 1992 for the Super Nintendo, the main feature of the gameplay is an expanded job system, similar to how it was in Final Fantasy III. You can choose different jobs for your characters to master, allowing them to learn special abilities and potentially master all 22 jobs that were available. Most of the jobs from Final Fantasy III are back, but new jobs introduced were Time Mage, Blue Mage, and Mime. Blue Mage would go on to become another Final Fantasy staple in the future. The story opens up with the main character, Bartz. Funny story, the Japanese name of this character was Butts, who investigates a fallen meteor that crashes into the Earth. He eventually meets several characters including Lena, Galuf, Ferris, and Kryl, with Galuf revealing the danger facing the 4 crystals that control the world's elements. These crystals act as a seal on Exdeath, an evil sorcerer. Bart and his company must keep the crystals from being exploited by Exdeath's influence and prevent his resurgence. I have to praise Final Fantasy V for the freedom of customization you have over your characters, due to the job system. This has always remained one of my favorite kinds of systems in RPGs, and that is the reason why I deeply love the Bravely Default series that have been released over the past decade. Sadly, this game would be the last Final Fantasy to incorporate interchangeable jobs and classes, with each later title having characters that would be a particular job for story purposes and not changeable. I have played through the Pixel Remaster about a year ago, and it still holds up well to this day, with the job system still feeling as fun and fresh as it did back in 1992. This is also the first Final Fantasy title that introduced us to the iconic character Gilgamesh, who would make appearances in several other future Final Fantasy titles. Coming in at number 8 is Final Fantasy XVI. Releasing in 2023, it saw producer Naoki Ishida in charge of his first mainline Final Fantasy title outside of the MMO Final Fantasy XIV, which he had been in charge of for the decade prior. Final Fantasy XVI is set on the twin continents of Valisthea, currently divided between 6 nations who hold power through access to magical crystals and dominance, humans who act as hosts for each nation's icon, or summon. Tensions between the nations escalate as a magical calamity called the Blight begins consuming the land. Clive Rosfield and his younger brother Joshua witness their kingdom destroyed, and they become involved in the growing conflict between Valisthea's nations and a secret power driving the war. The combat is real-time action, and I found it to be an improvement to Final Fantasy XV's. The icon powers that Clive slowly gains over the course of the game are fun, and the game also introduced us to the stagger mechanic, where you slowly chip away at a separate bar relative to an enemy's HP bar, and once the stagger is reached, the enemy enters several seconds of vulnerability where damage is severely increased against them. Though it could be said that this style of combat is kind of shallow. You basically attack and dodge around a battlefield while waiting for your icon abilities to get off cooldown, chipping away at an enemy's stagger meter before breaking it and then using all of your icon powers. Rinse and repeat. I've heard several times online that this game has been referred to as Devil May Cry Light. Combat aside, I was enthralled by the world building, characters, and story of the game, and they were all very strong. I cared for the majority of the main characters and their plights. The story is impressively grim, and that makes sense, because the producer Naoki Ishida supplied the first 4 seasons of Game of Thrones to each of the developers and basically told them to use it as inspiration for Final Fantasy XVI. The spectacle that is the various icon fights throughout the game were amazing, and the visuals were top-notch. After the lackluster release of Final Fantasy XIII and Final Fantasy XV, for me, Final Fantasy XVI was a breath of fresh air, and definitely the best Final Fantasy game released over the past 15 years. At number 7 is the classic Final Fantasy IV. Released in 1991, it was the first Final Fantasy game that put a well-crafted story first, where Final Fantasies 1 through 3 had very little story beats. The story follows Cecil, a Dark Knight, as he tries to prevent the sorcerer Golbez from seizing powerful crystals and destroying the world. He is joined on this quest by a frequently changing group of allies. Where in Final Fantasy 1 through 3, the main characters were blank templates that you, the player, can name, there's really no backstory or character development for any of them. That all changed in Final Fantasy IV, where the characters are fully realized and have their own backstories and personalities. This game also introduced us to the iconic active time battle system, which was so popular it would be in every future Final Fantasy game up to Final Fantasy X. Your party members and enemies have a bar that slowly fills up in combat, and once it's full, you can take action before it builds back up again. Very simple concept, but just so much fun in battle, and a lot of my favorite RPGs, even other than Final Fantasy, use a battle system similar to this. So I guess you could say that I have a lot of love and nostalgia for the active time bar system, which is why most of the games at the top of this list have that battle system in them. The story also hooks you right off the bat. Cecil's internal conflict of wondering if what he's doing is right is really compelling. I was also blown away at how the developers were able to convey such deep and mature feelings with primitive visuals. The supporting cast of characters are all really great, including Kain, probably the most iconic Dragoon depicted in the series. My only real complaint would be that the late game can become very grindy, but this is a minor issue and does not take away from all that the rest of the game is absolutely amazing. Coming in at number 6 is Final Fantasy X. Released in 2001 with the launch of the PlayStation 2, it was the first game in the series to feature voice acting and the next big step in graphics compared to the PlayStation 1 and Nintendo systems that came before. It was revolutionary at its time of release. Gone are the pre-rendered backgrounds found in the PlayStation 1 titles, and instead this game had a full 3D environment. Set in the fantasy world of Spira, the story revolves around a group of adventurers and their quest to defeat a rampaging monster known as Sin. The main character is Tidus, a star athlete in the fictional world of Blitzball, who finds himself in Spira after Sin attacks and destroys his home city of Zanarkand. Shortly after arriving in Spira, Tidus becomes a guardian to Summoner Yuna in her quest and pilgrimage to destroy Sin. Back is the active time bar system that we all know and love, but new to the series was the introduction to the Sphere Grid, which was one of my favorite things about the game. When you defeat enemies in battle, you gain ability points, or AP. You can use these AP to distribute amongst your characters for stat increases, in what was known as the Sphere Grid. The Sphere Grid was this massive board you could move your character's icon across, giving you powers in the way of increased strength, defense, magic, and various attacks and abilities. Each character had a different starting point on the Sphere Grid, but from there, you can move them in any direction you wanted. If you kept to their main course, you have attackers in Tidus and Auron, ranged and status effect attacker in Wakka, Black Mage for Lulu, White Mage and summoning abilities for Yuna, and dexterity or thief abilities for Riku. Then there's Kimahri, who kind of acts as a blue mage for the party, as his sphere grid starts in the very center of the board, and you can move his icon into any of the other characters' positions. Because of this, you can really make Kimahri into whatever you want, but because there's already another character that does the exact same stuff, only better, he is probably the weakest part of the cast of characters and my least favorite. The story is very engaging and probably contains one of the best love stories in the series with the two main protagonists. It is also one of the sadder games in the series. I won't give any big spoilers, but you really should give this game a play if you haven't already. And with that, we are officially in the top 5. And from here, I'll be going a little bit more in-depth as to why I'm including these titles. At number 5, we have Final Fantasy XIV. Final Fantasy XIV has a very interesting history, first releasing in 2010 as the series' second MMORPG after Final Fantasy XI. The original 1.0 version of the game was a massive failure, filled with so many bugs and glitches and mechanics that outright hindered player progress. After the first month or two of release and all of the negative player feedback, Square tried to remedy it by getting rid of the monthly subscription fee in order to try and keep players engaged. This all culminated a year later when they announced the game would be closing and relaunching. And so on November 11th, 2012, the 1.0 version of the game shut down and was relaunched in August of 2013 as A Realm Reborn. This is where the change in producers occurred. Out was Nobuaki Komoto, who worked on the 1.0 version of the game, and in came Naoki Ishida, who took the development team and reworked the game from the ground up for its 2.0 release, A Realm Reborn. Final Fantasy XIV is still an MMO at heart, so it is filled with what you would expect to find in an MMO. I also feel that A Realm Reborn's story still feels pretty dated to this point in time, and it's the hardest part of the game to get through. But if you can brute force your way through A Realm Reborn's 80 to 100 hour story, you will be rewarded with some of the best Final Fantasy moments of the past 2 decades. Because this game truly shines in its many expansions: Heavensward, Stormblood, Shadowbringers, and Endwalker. Each expansion is its own self-contained story, and each could almost be considered their own Final Fantasy title. This is also where producer Yoshida and his team really hit their stride. The stories told, and particularly Heavensward and Shadowbringers, are amongst the best Final Fantasy stories I have witnessed. And this game did the truly unthinkable in crowning who I believe the greatest Final Fantasy villain to be. For the longest time up until I played this game, that title had always gone to Kefka from Final Fantasy VI. But thanks to Final Fantasy XIV and the Shadowbringers expansion, Kefka has been dethroned for the charismatic and compelling character that is Emmett Selk. When you play Shadowbringers and experience Emmett Selk's story, it's one of those moments where you really sympathize with the villain. I can even see myself, if I were in the game's universe, as possibly being on Emmett Selk's side. Emmett Selk took the Saturday morning cartoon trope that the Ascians were throughout the first 3 expansions and really gave them just an amazing story. That is how truly well written his character arc is, and it cemented him as my all-time favorite Final Fantasy villain. The build-up, final dungeon and trial, and ending of Shadowbringers remains one of my all-time favorite Final Fantasy moments. I really wish I could go back and experience those moments for the first time again. So many people have stated that Final Fantasy XIV shouldn't count as a mainline game, or that they won't play it, simply because it's an MMORPG. They couldn't be more wrong. Final Fantasy XIV is more Final Fantasy than probably any of the other titles. It has all of the things that makes a Final Fantasy game a Final Fantasy, including hundreds and hundreds of Easter eggs to past Final Fantasy titles. If you are not playing this game simply because it is an MMO, you really have no idea what you are missing out on. The game also couldn't be more accessible to play, even if you wanted to play solo. All of the game's dungeons have been implemented with an AI party you can go through them with. The entire storyline of the game, which comes in at a massive 400 to 500 plus hours of playtime, can be played solo. The only reason you'd have to even team up with other players is to complete the occasional 8-man trials, there are a handful each expansion. But this is a small price to pay, so if you are hesitant because you don't want to play with other people, know that you can experience most of this game without even talking to or acknowledging other players. And it's not over yet, as the next expansion, Dawntrail, is scheduled to be released in June of 2024. I am honored to being able to call Eorzea my home for the past several years, and I can't wait to see what Naoki Yoshida and the Final Fantasy XIV development team do next. Number 4 on this list is a big one for me, as it was the first Final Fantasy game that I played back in the summer of 2000, and that is Final Fantasy VIII. Final Fantasy VIII released in 1999 for the PS1 and is considered a true black sheep in the series. The battle and leveling system are unique in this title, as it has what is called the Junction system, and a leveling system where enemies level with the party members. The Junction system to this day is very divisive amongst fans. You can basically junction magic to your character's stats, increasing their potency and attack power. Because of this, there really is no point in actually leveling up your characters, because you don't gain anything except for HP increases upon level up. And since enemies level with you, you could actually be hindering yourself by leveling up too much. The good thing about this is, there really is no point in the game where you are required to grind. The mixed reception of the combat and junction system aside, just about everything else in Final Fantasy VIII is spectacular. Set in an unnamed fantasy world with science fiction elements, the game follows a group of young mercenaries led by Squall Leonhart, as they are drawn into a conflict sparked by a sorceress named Adia, who seized control of a powerful military state. During the quest to defeat the sorceress and the forces manipulating her, Squall struggles with his role as a leader and develops a romance with one of his comrades, Rinoa. The story and setting are very engaging, with a slight dip in quality in the final quarter of the game. This was mostly due to rushed schedule and poor translation issues in the game from Japanese to English that left out very key plot points, and so the finale of the game feels very rushed and not very well explained. The world is one of the best in the series, sporting a modern/near modern style that wasn't really portrayed in a Final Fantasy up to that point. Squall Leonhart is also my personal favorite Final Fantasy character. I see a lot of hate for the character that boils down to him being a whiny, emo, loner type. And don't get me wrong, he is for the first half of the game. Squall suffered in his childhood from trauma and abandonment issues, and that is why he gives off his brutal, stone-cold attitude to others. But if you only ever take that away from his character, you must not have paid a lot of attention to the game's story or his character development, because that's what makes Squall such an interesting character, his character development. He has one of the best story arcs in the series, and as you progress through the game, you slowly start to see his ice-cold demeanor crack as he opens himself up more and more to his comrades, and the woman he is slowly but surely falling in love with. I like the love story and bickering between Squall and Rinoa, and I relate to Squall on a personal level because I am very introverted myself. The game also served as an evolution of sorts to Nobuo Uematsu's soundtrack, with this game also having the very first vocal theme in the series' history, called Eyes on Me by Faye Wong. In fact, I would argue that this game has the best soundtrack in the series, and is definitely one of Uematsu's greatest works. There are tons and tons of great and relaxing themes that make use of piano tunes, great battle themes, and other atmospheric ones. It also introduced us to Triple Triad, probably the greatest minigame in the Final Fantasy series. I could roam around the game's world for hours just playing a game of cards with NPCs and would not lose interest one bit. I can see why a lot of people wouldn't like Final Fantasy VIII, but to me it has too many charming qualities and an incredible amount of nostalgia that I just absolutely love. I'm pretty sure the reason why I love RPGs to this day is because of Final Fantasy VIII. Coming in at number 3, it's the big one, Final Fantasy VII. Released in 1999 for the PS1, it is perhaps one of the most revolutionary titles in gaming history, and also a big reason as to why Final Fantasy became so popular outside of Japan. The marketing for this game was insane back in 1997, with Square spending over $100 million US dollars on commercials and advertisements for the game, and it worked. Just about everyone who owned a PS1 at that time checked this game out, whether it was purchasing it outright or renting it from a game store or borrowing it from a friend. The story follows Cloud Strife, a mercenary who joins an eco-terrorist organization called Avalanche to stop the world-controlling megacorporation Shinra from using the planet's life essence as an energy source. Events send Cloud and his allies in pursuit of Sephiroth, a superhuman who seeks to wound the planet and harness the power released to be reborn as a god. The story ranks high on my personal favorite list of Final Fantasy stories, and the characters are all memorable and fleshed out. It feels like every town and dungeon you go to has its own iconic moment, from the opening bombing mission, to the entirety of Gold Saucer, to the revelations you learn in Cosmo Canyon. I could go on and on. Unfortunately, Final Fantasy VII might be one of the harder games to get into if you tried playing it for the first time today. The visuals don't really hold up too well, and while that doesn't matter to me, someone who played these games back in their own time, I understand some people could be put off by it. But if you can manage to look past the graphics, you're in for a spectacular story, characters you truly care for, and a mystery you can't wait to see unraveled. Whenever I hear the main theme of Final Fantasy VII, whether it be in-game, in a YouTube video, on my Spotify playlist, my heart swells. Uematsu created an overworld theme that had distinct high and lows, serving as a motif for main parts of the story. I knew the game was very special and meant a lot to me, but I didn't truly realize how much until the remake. I don't know if I've gotten more goosebumps than when I played through Remake and most recently Rebirth. A lot of it was the music. The new arrangements are absolutely spectacular. Final Fantasy VII introduced the Materia system, a way to commoditize the learning of magic that built upon the foundations of its predecessor in Final Fantasy VI. This is my favorite leveling system in an RPG. This allowed players to mix and match different kinds of materia, allowing for an unprecedented level of party customization. One of my favorite gaming memories is the introduction and build-up of Sephiroth as an antagonist in the opening hours of the game. There's no question that this character is amongst the most iconic in gaming, but I think it's often overlooked how expertly Sephiroth was introduced through clever storytelling. For the first 5 to 6 hours of Final Fantasy VII, you only hear Sephiroth's name in passing a couple of times. Pretty much all that we are given in this is that he was a war hero who was killed on a mission 5 years before the events of the game. The first example is Cloud's flashback with Tifa at the well in Nibelheim, where Cloud states that he wants to join soldiers so that he can be just like Sephiroth. The second example is a mention by President Shinra, who asks Cloud his name, and lets him know that he can't be expected to remember every soldier's name, unless they become another Sephiroth. While Sephiroth's name comes up a couple of times, we aren't really given the time to speculate on who or what he is, and the Shinra Company are introduced as the initial villains in the story. This creates mystery around the character, establishing a promise of something to come. And it all culminates when Cloud and company are infiltrating the Shinra headquarters and find President Shinra dead, with Sephiroth's sword sticking out of his back. I think it is these moments that are largely responsible for how popular Sephiroth's character became. At this point, we've only heard his name a couple of times, and seen how dangerous he can be. Already, we fear Sephiroth, though we don't even know what he looks like. That fear of the unknown makes him all the more intimidating. And then it's the Nibelheim flashback scene that cements Sephiroth's legacy. Cloud retells the mission he was sent on with Sephiroth 5 years prior to the other party members when they're resting in the village of Kalm. And the scene is a masterclass of how to tell a story through gameplay. Because it's a long scene, the developers made the right choice in making it an interactive memory rather than having Cloud simply narrate it in text only. And for those of us who played this game back in the day, these battles where you have Sephiroth in your party were jaw-dropping, because of how powerful Sephiroth was. The writers could have simply told us in a dialogue box how powerful Sephiroth was and left it at that. But the fact that they paired this statement with an interactive flashback that had battles made it hit home in a much different way. It is one of the many reasons why this game and the whole sequence of events remains so dear to my heart. Coming in at number 2, we have the classic Final Fantasy VI. Released in 1994 for the Super Nintendo, this was the final game in the series to feature 2D sprite-based graphics. This was developed in only 1 year after Final Fantasy V, which just blows my mind. When people discuss what the greatest Final Fantasy game ever is, this one frequently comes up, and there are many great reasons as to why. Set in a world with technology resembling the Second Industrial Revolution, the game's story follows an expanding cast that includes 14 playable characters, the most in any Final Fantasy game. While many of this game's characters start out with seemingly their own job archetype, Final Fantasy VI was also a complete departure from past entries as it allowed players to equip espers to allow every character to learn magic. This system would later serve as the main basis for Final Fantasy VII's Materia system, and it works just as well here as it did there. The story deals with the themes of a rebellion against an immoral military dictatorship, pursuit of a magical arms races, use of chemical weapons in warfare, depictions of violent and apocalyptic confrontations, several personal redemption arcs, and the renewal of hope and life itself. There's a really heartwarming story with main character Terra, and the game shifts focus to several other characters that could arguably be just as main of a character as Terra. So many of the characters have excellent, expansive backstories that explain why they are the way they are. But perhaps the most noteworthy quality of Final Fantasy VI is that it truly had some quality moments, including scenes and outcomes that you had complete control over. The story itself is excellent and expertly paced, with the exception of 1 or 2 blemishes I can think of. The Massa and the introduction of 2 new party members relatively late in the story, and it felt like a lot of integral world building and setup felt it was crammed in before the finale of the third act. However, what makes Final Fantasy VI so good and memorable is the way they tell the story. For the first time in the series, they allow time and space for the characters, allowing them to speak to each other, express their emotions and concerns. It's these character building scenes that make the story so strong. Inside the Returner hideout, the walk through the mountains of Narshe, the boat ride to Thamasa. All of these scenes build strong characters, but what good are strong heroes without an equally compelling villain? Kefka is one of the greatest villains in video game history. Much like the heroes, he has his own development arc. What makes him such a great bad guy is that he is a constant force throughout the game. He is introduced early on and interacts with the heroes. His bombastic and over-the-top personality, complete with awfully amazing one-liners, paint a picture of how unstable he truly is. Because he appears as a foe several times throughout the game, he doesn't just become something you have to defeat, but want to. Especially as he seems to always get away. And the consistent reinforcement of his evil that is shown to the player firsthand. The burning of Castle Figaro, the poisoning of the water supply at Doma, the slaying of several Espers and General Leo himself. His evil is always shown, not told. This all culminates in Kefka and Emperor Gestahl using the Warring Triad statues to raise the floating continent, and Terra and company land to try to stop him. The continent is reinforced by powerful enemies and a build-up to what appears to be the final boss. But all we see is Kefka reveal how evil and truly beyond help he is. Kefka betrays and murders Emperor Gestahl, and then the unthinkable happens. You lose. You don't stop Kefka. The good guys fail. Kefka uses the Warring Triad to upset the balance of the world, rip it apart, killing countless innocents in the process. The party try to escape on the airship, but it splits in half and goes crashing towards the Earth. Scene fades to black with a simple text saying, "And on that day, the world was changed forever." And then you realize you are only at the halfway point of the game. This second half, called the World of Ruin, acts as a sort of open-world approach to the game. Kefka has won. He destroyed the world, and is now ruling over it, smiting towns and civilians from atop his tower as if they were ants. A majority of the content in this half of the game is actually optional. You can go and encounter Kefka at any point with just 3 initial party members. Or you could go and find out what happened to your friends. The World of Ruin also incorporates what I interpret to be the main theme of Final Fantasy VI. The whole game is about loss. How does each character respond to loss? These questions are answered as you search for your friends in the World of Ruin. Even Kefka represents a response to loss. Nihilism. Nothing matters. Why bother building? Why bother doing anything? To Kefka, he's doing everyone a favor because he thinks others can't see what he sees. That life is meaningless. Of all of the Final Fantasy games I have played, none have carried the same emotional weight in such a manner as Final Fantasy VI. The Final Fantasy series had been loved up to this point, but it was Final Fantasy VI's commitment to more mature themes and a fantastic cast of characters that made it go from a good series to a special one. Final Fantasy VI will always have that special place in my heart, and it is my personal favorite Final Fantasy game. Now, while I say Final Fantasy VI is my personal favorite game, there is one title that beats it at the #1 spot, and that is Final Fantasy IX. Released in the year 2000, it has a rather interesting launch history as Final Fantasy IX came out for the PlayStation 1 when the PlayStation 2 had already released a few months prior. Also, Final Fantasy X and Final Fantasy XI had already been revealed before Final Fantasy IX even released. So I feel like this is possibly why the game didn't sell nearly as well as its predecessors Final Fantasy VII and VIII did. I always felt bad for Final Fantasy IX. It quickly became one of my favorite in the series, and it stayed that way over the decades. It never made much sense to me as to why people seemed to shun and ignore it. The medieval fantasy aesthetic that began to deviate significantly ever since, well, Final Fantasy VI. More and more machines and technology and sci-fi were present in Final Fantasy VI, 7, and 8. And Final Fantasy IX brought us right back to where it began. Fantasy. And this was intentional, as it was to be the final game directed by series creator Hironobu Sakaguchi. After this, he left Square. It's also the last time Nobuo Uematsu was the sole composer in a Final Fantasy title. It's not only a reflection of the series as a whole, but a celebration. They wanted to go out with a bang, and remember where they came from, and pay tribute to the whole series. And that's what they did. There are numerous Easter eggs, references, and callbacks to past Final Fantasy games. Moogles, Chocobos, the robes of a white mage. The greatest black mage character in Final Fantasy history. This game also serves as the final time the active time bar system was used. The battle system used for the past 6 games in a row. What does Final Fantasy IX do that's more innovative or special over its predecessors? Nothing really. The battles are exactly what you would expect if you played any of the games between 4 and 8. And that's okay. Sometimes you don't need wacky new things to make something enjoyable. Final Fantasy IX's battles are solid. It also sets up interesting boss battles. They take strategy, playing around enemy attacks, and careful timing of spells. They felt more involved than the typical HP sponges a lot of bosses can be in RPGs. The game doesn't really do anything wrong, except perhaps Tetra Master. I think it might be because I enjoyed Triple Triad so much in Final Fantasy VIII, but the card game implemented in Final Fantasy IX is pretty stupid. It has the same idea as Triple Triad, where you need to take over as many of your opponent's cards as possible, except it's more random, more confusing, and a lot less fun to play. But Final Fantasy IX's best thing was nothing to do with its gameplay. It was its story, thanks to further improved presentation. The cutscenes in Final Fantasy IX are incredible. There's a frantic animation and cinematography like nothing before. I didn't really appreciate this at the time, but I am thoroughly impressed now. And it has a lot to do with the art style. Final Fantasy IX opts for a stylized, more cartoonish look. And sadly, this turned a lot of people off of the game, which is a shame because Final Fantasy IX's graphics have probably held up the best to the modern day. The graphics are arguably better now than they were originally. The soundtrack was also good. Being a throwback to the rest of the series, Final Fantasy IX brings back iconic songs in all of their glory. Each character has their own theme, and they're not just catchy songs, but it also provides supplement to match each character's personalities. I can't think of a single song in the entire soundtrack that I dislike. One of the best things about the plot is the characters. They all talk to each other like they're actual freaking people. Their words chosen are believable. They often bring up their feelings, and the conflicts that ensue are often solved because the characters take a moment or two to actually talk to each other. One of the main goals of the development team was to really focus on the characters and their development, and they nailed it. They are some of the best Final Fantasy characters in the series, no question. Vivi is easily the breakout star. He's so endearing and innocent and has a heartbreaking story of self-discovery. Garnet is far from the stuck-up princess stereotype. Her self-improvement and growth to be better than she was before is her main motivation every step of the way. Freya is a dragoon of Burmecia, who left home for her own reasons. And the supporting cast of characters are all great. But let me take a moment now to talk about who I think the best character in the game is, and my personal favorite, and that is Steiner. Steiner is not likable. He's an oaf, a lot of times actually working against the rest of the party and their interests. He doesn't do any of this out of malice. He's only doing what he feels is right, and that's what I love about him. His internal dilemma is too good. Watching his character development unfold is the strongest out of everyone's. He's proud, devout, and takes pride in being a knight incredibly seriously. But he can see the pain and sadness in Princess Garnet, and wants only the best for her, yet he is stuck in his personal code. Watching him be an obstacle to everyone else early on, to disagreeing with Zidane every chance he gets, to the point where he calls the Don a comrade, to recognizing Garnet's desire and knowing when to give them space, shows just how much he grows as a character throughout the game. He isn't the most likable or lovable, but he is the best character in the game. Final Fantasy VII is the most important game in the series. Final Fantasy VI is my personal favorite, but Final Fantasy IX is the best one. It has too many good things going for it to not be the best. It has the most well-rounded, solid gameplay of them all, and is enjoyable without being remarkable in any way. More importantly, it's the story and the characters that make Final Fantasy IX resonate to this day. If I had to pick one Final Fantasy game for any newcomer to the series to give a try for the first time, it would be Final Fantasy IX. Thanks for listening to this Humble Fans ranking list, and I will have more gameplay videos for you in the future. Have a great day.